Good afternoon and welcome to the online Geneva Trade and Development Workshop jointly organized by CEPR, the Geneva School of Economics and Management, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the World Trade Organization, and UNTAD. For today's seminar, I'm delighted to introduce David Atkin from MIT, who is going to be talking about the value of face-to-face interactions. The presentation will last 1 hour and will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. During the presentation, please feel free to ask clarifying questions on the Q&A. With the help of my co-hosting colleagues, I will relay the questions to David so that he can address them. We are also very happy to have with us one of David's co-author, Anton Popov, who will help us clarify some of the questions that you will be asking in the Q&A. So without any further ado, David, you have the floor for the next hour.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just, can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present. This is work with Keith Chen, Anton Popov, and as we were just discussing, Anton's on the chat and he'll try and answer any pressing questions. So this is a paper that tries to open up the black box that is knowledge spillovers, and in particular, trying to think about the returns to face-to-face interactions. Okay, so the question of what are the returns to face-to-face interactions is obviously a very important question for urban economics, for economic geography. It's important for understanding the determinants of agglomeration or why cities exist. It's also an important question for trade, particularly when thinking about the kind of puzzling finding that the world doesn't appear to be getting much flatter despite the massive drop in transportation and logistics costs. Finally, it's very relevant for understanding a very recent change, which is due to COVID, many people have started working from home, and people think that a lot of that will persist, particularly amongst some of the tech firms in Silicon Valley that we're thinking about. And obviously that has implications for face-to-face interactions, and I will be trying to think a little bit about that as well. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about the returns to face-to-face interactions in a specific context, and that's going to be the context of innovation and the setting of Silicon Valley. And you know, this is a context which is kind of been conjectured, particularly by Saxenian, that it was indeed this kind of frequency and type of interaction that made Silicon Valley what it is today. Is maybe best summarized by this quote by Tom Wolfe. Every year there was some place, the Wagon Wheel, Chez Yvonne, Ricky's, the Roundhouse, where members of this esoteric fraternity, the young men and women of the semiconductor industry, would head after work to have a drink, gossip, brag, and trade war stories about phase jitters, phantom circus, etc., etc. So what are we going to be doing today is we're going to be using smartphone location data to try and get a handle on the role of face-to-face interactions in generating knowledge spillovers in this setting of Silicon Valley. Okay, so I think in this audience, I don't really need to explain what knowledge spillovers are. But what I will say is that there are kind of three large literatures that try and identify the existence of knowledge spillovers as well as the magnitude of those spillovers. There's a literature pioneered by Ellison, Glaser, and Kerr that looks at industry co-location decisions and how those are related to various drivers of agglomeration, R&D and patent matrices to kind of proxy for knowledge spillovers. There's an enormous literature started by Jaffe, Trachtenberg, and Henderson that shows that firms are more likely to cite other firms close to them than cite firms far away, and they interpret that result as evidence of knowledge spillovers. And finally, there's a literature started by Glaser et al. In 1992 that draws a distinction between sort of spillovers that occur within their own industry or across industries, and talk a lot about knowledge spillovers, where they call those across industry spillovers Jane Jacobs spillovers after the noted urban theorist. So what's common across these three literatures is they're only identifying quite broad mechanisms that are operating through proximity. And what we're going to try to do today is kind of drill in there to try and open up that black box. And in particular, we're going to draw on very rich data on person-to-person interactions. And that's going to essentially be smartphone proximity, two people with smartphones who are close to each other at the same time. And that's going to allow us to isolate a sort of a key mechanism here, which are face-to-face meetings. And in particular, we're going to link these sort of worker meetings, these face-to-face meetings, with citations of patents between employers of these workers. And those are going to be our proxies for knowledge flows. Okay, and this is going to give us an ability to uncover a relationship between knowledge flows and face-to-face interactions. Now, of course, it's very hard to interpret that relationship for obvious reasons. Maybe the sort of biggest worry here is reverse causation, which is I may find out that you're working on something similar to what I'm working on, and then organize a meeting in order to find out more from you. Okay, and then causation is going in exactly the opposite direction. And so what we're going to be doing here is we're going to use an instrumental variable strategy. And the basic idea is that we're going to have measures of the total meetings between firm I and firm J. And we're going to try and get a proxy for this kind of serendipitous meetings, the chance meetings between those workers, which won't be sort of subject to this reverse causality concern. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're not going to look at the meetings between I and J. We're going to look at the meetings between a firm adjacent to I and a firm adjacent to J. And then we can use those meetings to essentially instrument for the actual meetings between I and J. Okay, and that's going to solve the sort of most direct reverse causality concern that they learned about what J was doing and so decided to meet them. But we still worried a lot about omitted variable bias, especially related to spatial correlation of the error terms. And so we're going to do a range of things to deal with that. Most importantly, we're going to be able to control for bilateral demographic distances between firms or between establishments at the IJ level. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to throw out from these not I, not J pairs, any pair where the two firms are in industries that ever cite each other. And that's going to get rid of a lot of these meetings that may be planned meetings between not I and not J, or meetings of similar types that we may be particularly worried about in terms of correlation with the error term. And I'll talk in a lot more detail through all of those issues as we go along. Okay, so what do we get out of this IV strategy? We're going to get an estimate, which is very much a local average treatment effect. It's the returns to face-to-face meetings induced by the variation generated by our instrument, which is really variations in the meetings geography of the city. You know, the type of amenities, housing, etc., transportation networks that separate workers between I and J. So this is obviously of great interest to economic geographers, urban planners, etc., trying to think about how changing how often people bump into each other may change knowledge flows in the city. And that's what this late estimate is going to give us. And we'll also explore one particular mechanism, which is labor pooling, the flow of workers between firms who may spread knowledge with them. Okay, so that's going to be our sort of first contribution, showing the evidence that face-to-face meetings impact knowledge flows. Our second contribution is going to be to try and disentangle that. So our IV estimate is going to combine, sort of broadly speaking, two types of meetings. The first are knowledge flows that occur due to serendipitous meetings. And we're going to kind of take back the term Jacobs spillovers and call these Jacobs spillovers. These are sort of the flows resulting from serendipitous meetings between workers. And why are we taking back Glaser 1992 notation? Well, here's a more recent quote by Ed Glaser that suggests he may have changed his mind. Jacobs' greatest insight was that cities succeed by enabling people to connect with one another. Many of the finest achievements of human civilization occurred because smart people learned from one another in cities. As Jacobs understood better than anyone else, the chance encounters facilitated by cities are the stuff of human progress. So we're going to sort of call these Jacobs spillovers, these chance encounters leading to knowledge flows. There's a second type of knowledge flow we may be picking up, which are those that occur due to planned meetings, where our instrument, which is the kind of meetings geography of the city, may be lowering the cost of a face-to-face meeting. The fact that there's a coffee shop conveniently located between us may mean I move what would have been a phone conversation to an in-person conversation, for example. And so we may also be picking up some of the returns to those types of planned face-to-face meetings. So our second contribution is we're going to show how we can construct a test for whether the estimates I showed you on the previous screen are indeed measuring the returns to serendipity, these Jacob spillovers. And the way we're going to do that is essentially, if it's the case that we could separately identify the returns to serendipitous meetings and planned meetings if we had measures of serendipitous and planned meetings, i.e. we could partition the total meetings into those two groups. That's clearly impossible since we have no idea whether people being close to each other was planned or was serendipitous. But what we're going to show is that if we have two instruments that load differently on planned and serendipitous meetings, then we can essentially go and run the instrumental variables regressions with each of those instruments separately. And if we believe that one of those instruments, at least, is a relevant instrument for serendipitous meetings, and the nature of the instruments I described means that's going to be satisfied, then if we find the same coefficients when we use either instrument, it must either be the case that the returns are the same to serendipitous or face-to-face or planned meetings, or that our first stage isn't relevant for the planned meetings. And I'll go in a lot more detail on how we're going to do that, but essentially we are going to be able to find such instruments by taking the not I, not J meetings and dividing them into those which occur during the workday and those that occur during the night and weekend. And it's very reasonable to believe that those occurring during the workday are relatively stronger shifters of these face-to-face planned meetings than ones night and weekend, which are occurring near people's homes, in parks, in movie theaters, etc. And so we're going to be able to do this test, and we will not be able to reject that the coefficients are the same using either instrument. And I'll provide some suggestive evidence that the reason that is the case is because indeed our instrument isn't shifting planned meetings, and those returns to planned meetings may indeed be higher. Okay, so just to kind of summarize there, first I'll kind of show you this IV, which will give us this late estimate, and then I'll try and convince you that what we're picking up here is the returns to serendipity. Okay, so one final thing I'll mention here is, I've been using the word spillover. In reality, I don't have the data to, really prove that this is a externality. In particular, I'd need to know whether or not when these people bump into each other at random, there's some compensation discussed, some transfers going on. We're not going to be able to get data on that. Anecdotally, there's no evidence that takes place, but it is a possibility. Even then, if there was compensation, there still may be matching frictions that would lead to externalities. Okay, and there's a sort of existing literature which I've already discussed, sort of 3 large bunches of, and I'll kind of leave it at that. So before I move on, were there any questions? Hello?
Sorry, David, yes. There is a question by Miguel Espinosa. The question is, how does this paper relate to the forthcoming review of economic studies, face-to-face communication in organizations by Diego Batistón, Jordi Blanes, and Thorn Hirschmeyer?
I haven't read that paper in depth, and so I'll need to look closer. So I don't know. I don't have an answer off the top of my head.
A second question is whether there is some way of controlling. So you are after these face-to-face interactions. Is there some way of controlling for those interactions that are not face-to-face through phone calls, emails?
Yes. So essentially the way our instrument is working is we're asking, if I change the kind of meetings geography of the city so people bump into each other more, what would be the effect on knowledge flows? And so that's going to potentially be shifting some meetings that never would have happened at all to happening face-to-face. It potentially would have, those are particularly true with the serendipitous meetings. It could also be true with planned meetings. Like I wasn't going to bother actually speaking to you, but it is convenient for me to meet you face to face, so let me go and arrange that. More likely, I was going to speak to you using some other means, and we're shifting on that margin on the plan dimension. And so it's a combination of all of those three. It really is what happens if I kind of change the structure of the city so that people bump into each other more. How does that affect knowledge flows?
I get so there is another question on identification by Michele Pelizzaris, which if you want to kick for later, you let me know. But the question is, how should we think about the counterfactual associated to your instrument? It is not meeting at all, or meeting via some non-face-to-face technology, telephone, Skype, etc. My understanding is that your instrument compares meeting face-to-face against non-meeting at all. Is this correct?
So as I just mentioned, I guess in the answer to the previous question, it's capturing a bit of both of those. What it really is, I mean, the reduced form is probably the easiest to think about, where the reduced form is, imagine I changed, for example, zoning of the city such that people were moving in different locations. That would potentially lead certain firms to bump into each other more, other firms to bump into each other less. And I'm going to tell you about the kind of change in knowledge flows that's occurring bilaterally because of that.
Okay, thank you very much, David.
Okay, so let me kind of jump in. First, I'll describe the data, the three components of that data, and then we'll talk about the empirical strategy. That's where I'll discuss a lot of the identification issues. It will hopefully clarify some of these questions as I write down the empirical specifications more formally. And then at the end of that section, I'll talk about separating serendipitous meetings from those that are planned. Okay, so our setting Silicon Valley, in particular, we've drawn a 50-mile circle around Stanford University. As everyone knows, this is a major engine of US growth and innovation. It's also a dominant location for innovation in the US. I was kind of surprised by the magnitude of this. 20% of our patent applications, which is the full pool of recent patent applications, 20% of those with US-based inventors have at least one Silicon Valley resident. So it's enormously dominant in US patent innovation. It's also a culture that's well known for face-to-face interactions. We may think that maybe we're going to find importance of face-to-face interactions here, but that's kind of unique to Silicon Valley. Well, here's just one example from the Boston Globe earlier this year. The suburbs are cheaper, but they don't have what Kendall Square, that's the area around MIT, has for biotechs, serendipity. So I think certainly in innovative areas in the US, this is going to be true as well, and maybe more generally than that. Okay, and as I mentioned in the intro, people have kind of worried that this may be under threat. Here are a few recent articles suggesting that this shift to working from home that may persist after the pandemic ends may potentially cause big damage to Silicon Valley by reducing these face-to-face interactions. Okay, so our data set we pull together in three steps. The first is we're going to pull all addresses of patenting firms in Orbis, and we're going to match those to kind of a map of the Silicon Valley area, and we're going to match them to building rooftops. If there's multiple establishments in the same building, we won't be able to know who's in which establishment, and so our meetings measures are going to be the same for those establishments. That's going to add a bit of noise, but not bias. There are some buildings on large campuses we had to add manually, since there's just a single address for, say, the Googleplex. This is going to lead us to 18,000 patenting establishments across 13,000 firms, 9,000 buildings. Okay, here's a map of San Francisco. The blue shaded squares are these patenting establishments. Okay, so let me spend a little more time on the smartphone data. That's the more novel aspect. So as people probably know now, smartphone operating systems estimate your location approximately every 5 to 10 minutes, more frequently if you're moving. And they're going to share that location with any open or backgrounded apps that have permissions. And the location data we're going to use comes from a company called SafeGraph that's been buying data from many apps. We're going to cover about 50 million US smartphones by the end of our 2017 sample period. Now, is this a complete mapping of these 50 million US phones? No, it only is going to record pings when the phones are on, when they have reception, when the app is open and backgrounded. And so a phone where we have records from them for that day, we're going to have for about 15 hours a day, or a bit over 15 hours, and we're not necessarily going to have them for every day as well. Okay, what do these data look like? We're going to identify workers as smartphones who spend at least 20 hours per month in one of our establishments, patenting establishments. Okay, we can kind of raise that. We don't think it's going to make a difference. We take the mode if they're in multiple locations. In the thickest month, this is going to give us 51,500 workers across 15,900 establishments or 7,000 buildings. And reassuringly, these worker counts strongly correlate with the LEHD load statistics, which are at the establishment level, summed up across census block group and industry. And we get a strong correlation conditional on census block group and industry. Okay, so that's our smartphone data. How are we going to use that to construct face-to-face meetings? So we're going to define a meeting as two people in the same geohash 7 in the same half-hour window of our sample period. Okay, so these are kind of people who are proximate to each other based on where their smartphones are located. And then we can obtain a meetings probability as follows. We're essentially going to take the total meetings we actually observed between I and J and divide by all the possible meetings they could have had given the number of smartphones we observed from each establishment during that half-hour window. Okay, and why are we doing that? Well, partly to control for missing workers. You know, sometimes we don't observe smartphones, sometimes we do, and we wouldn't want the number of smartphones we observe to drive this measure. And partly because, as I'll show you below, this has a nice economic interpretation. So let me give you a specific example. Imagine we see 3 people from I and 4 people from J in a coffee shop at the same time, and we're going to have 12 total meetings. And imagine in total, we observed 4 people from each firm during that half-hour window. There's going to be 16 potential meetings. And so we'll have 12 over 16 for that half-hour window. We'll go and sum that over every location in order to get the total meetings numerator. And then we'll do that for every half-hour window over our full sample period. Okay, so let me give you some economic interpretation for that measure. So this total meetings probability, what it's measuring is the probability that a random worker from I beats a random worker from J. Okay, and so this kind of provides an estimate of whether a Silicon Valley inventor listed on I's patent meets a Silicon Valley inventor listed on J's patent. Okay, so we're getting a probability that these guys met each other. Okay, and this is kind of the appropriate measure if we think that citable knowledge only flows when inventors meet each other. And later we'll explore an alternative mechanism that the more colleagues you have, the more chance of knowledge flows, and then there'll be size effects. And then finally, we're going to take a log of this to obtain a bell-shaped distribution, and to get rid of all these missings, when the numerator is 0, we'll fill it in with a very small number. Okay, so before moving on, I guess one thing I should state here, which will come up again, is we don't really think we're able to capture all the actual meetings that led to the actual patent citations we'll talk about later. We're kind of thinking about this in a probabilistic sense. Okay, given that these guys were in the same place or very similar place at the same time, they may have met each other that time, or maybe they met each other previously, given that they tend to go to the same places at the same time, based on the kind of locations in the city that they frequent. Okay, and we'll talk more about that when I show you my specification.
David, a quick question from Julia is whether you're able to infer the duration of these meetings between people using the smartphone data.
Yeah, so in principle, we could see how long that they were proximate to each other and do something with that. As I said, eventually we're going to be essentially running this in the cross section because we don't have enough panel variation. We have a short panel. And so essentially the way to think about what we're doing is we're going to say, do firms whose workers have higher probabilities of bumping into each other cite each other more, rather than saying, did this particular meeting 8 months later lead to a citation? And really, if we had a longer panel and there was kind of a firmer mapping between when meeting occurs and when the application is filed, we may be able to do more on that, but we can't, at least with our data set at present.
I also have a question from Sandra Sequeira on patents. Shall I ask it now or a little bit later?
If it's on patents, I'm going to do patents in a second.
Okay, so I'll let you go.
Yeah. Okay, so let me show you our face-to-face meetings measures. So these are two firms. This is Google and this is Apple. Google's in Mountain View, Apple's in Cupertino. These are where Apple workers, where we see the Apple workers go. This is where we see the Google workers go. If I overlay those, in green is where they're kind of both going to the similar locations. That's not where they're in the same place at the same time. That's this sparser map here. The darker purple means more meetings. Where are these places? So we've marked most of them that we could easily find. They're apartment buildings, they're supermarkets, they're office buildings, there's the airport, for example, etc. Okay, so this is kind of where our variation's coming from. Some are in work locations, many are in kind of amenity locations. Okay, so what does our total meetings probability variation looks like? Let me show you for one firm. This is for Google's Mountain View establishment. And this is the bilateral total meetings between every other establishment in our sample. And dark green means there are more meetings occurring. And what you can see is there's a lot of meetings close around Google. And there's also a lot in San Francisco and relatively few in the East Bay. If I zoom in, you can kind of see that in kind of a closer way, where there are, a lot of these meetings are coming very close to the Google offices, but they are spread elsewhere as well, and there's plenty of variation. Okay, so now onto our patent data. So we're going to do something fairly standard. We kind of follow the literature here in talking about knowledge flows using the citations in patents. Where we do differ a little bit, and this will partially answer Sandra's question, is we're not actually going to use granted patents. We're going to use patent applications, partly because we find out about patent applications many years before cited patents, and that'll be relevant given when our data runs. But the other reason we prefer patent applications is because what we want to know is kind of the knowledge that is present in the firm at the time of the invention. A lot of these citations are subsequently added after back and forth with the examiner. And so those are typically included in patent citation data. They're not going to be in the patent application citations. Okay, so this kind of helps a little bit in terms of, is this actual knowledge? This is certainly not the stuff which the examiner discusses with the patenter. The other thing I can say in response to Sandra's question is, how much of this is real innovation? Well, I guess at this stage, we're kind of interested in knowledge flows, not necessarily real innovation. We're using the citations as kind of a way of capturing actual flows of knowledge. A kind of obvious important question is, how much does this type of knowledge lead to innovation? That's something our empirical strategy isn't so well equipped to capture. Essentially, we'll need, the amount of innovation at the firm level, and everything I'm going to do is going to be bilateral. But we can talk a bit later about, if we had some exogenous kind of innovation shocks at certain firms, we may be able to kind of see whether the firms who bump into them the most also see spikes in their innovation. That's not something we've done at present. The one thing I can say here is we do have in-text citations here, and those in-text citations are likely to be filled out by the patenter rather than the lawyer themselves. And so that's kind of helpful there as well. Okay, so Sandra, if there's still some concerns, maybe you can add them to the chat and I'll be able to see them. So this is going to give us about 15,000 patent applications from inventors living in Silicon Valley, citing other Silicon Valley patents, which we're going to then merge into the data on meetings. Okay, this is just a picture of this cross-citing activity, and you can see there's a big web. Firms are citing each other all over the bay, although there's definitely more citations between certain big firms and other ones. Okay, so one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the fact that citations occur at a firm-to-firm level. Meanwhile, establishments are occurring at the meetings occur at the establishment to establishment level. So how are we going to deal with this? So we're going to be treating citations as an inventor-to-inventor knowledge flow. And then we're going to have to go and assign these patents to a particular establishment. And we're going to do that using the hometowns of the inventors. So at the time of submission, they list their hometown. And what we can do is we can use the workers we see from each establishment. We know where they go in the evening, and so we know where they live. We can use that to calculate an empirical likelihood that a worker from a given establishment lives in a specific town. And then we can use that empirical likelihood to go and proportionally assign these patents to different establishments. Okay, and that's going to be our kind of baseline, and that lines up with the idea that this total meetings probability is the probability that a particular inventor who's based in a single establishment meets a particular inventor who's based at another establishment. For robustness, we can go and make a different assumption that knowledge spreads throughout the firm, and it's a firm-to-firm meetings are what matter. The evidence suggests it's more along establishment to establishment than firm to firm, based on what happens when we do that. Okay, and finally, with very skewed distribution, we'll take an inverse hyperbolic sign. Okay, so let me now sort of turn to the empirical strategy. This is where things will get a little more dense, and I'll try to go through this as clearly as possible. Okay, so the basic regression we want to run is we're going to regress establishment I to J sites at time period T on these kind of meetings measure, this total meetings probability between I and J. We're going to lag that so that you know, the kind of last meetings are occurring before the last applications are come in. And then we're also going to include controls, most notably establishment I and establishment J dummies, as well as rich controls, for example, for physical distance between I and J. Okay, so in terms of that lag structure, as I mentioned, we have a very short panel, so we can't really do much with that. So all we're going to do here is we're going to lag everything 6 months. So we're going to look at patent citations that occur kind of 6 months, between 6 months after the start of our meetings data and 6 months after the end of our meetings data. So given the serial correlation in the error term and in the meetings probability, we're effectively asking whether establishments whose workers are more likely to meet each other are more likely to cite each other. Okay, and so as I mentioned, we're not pinning down a particular meeting that led to a particular innovation. That's kind of too ambitious given our data. Okay, so what does this regression reveal? Well, it tells us at least whether or not there's an association between citations and meetings that goes beyond physical distance, which is what people have looked at in the literature so far. But as I discussed in the introduction, total meetings probability measure is very much endogenous. In particular, we may think people arrange planned meetings in order to learn from J when they know that J is working on something similar. So the kind of basic building block for our instrument is the idea that while those planned meetings are particularly worrisome, if we could measure the chance meetings between I and J, that might be plausibly exogenous and could serve as an instrument if we could measure it. We can't measure those chance meetings, but we can construct an instrument that is going to be closely related to those chance meetings. And then I'll discuss the exclusion restriction in more detail. Okay, so the basic idea is as follows. So if we take the meetings between workers from a firm I'll call not I and a firm I'll call not J, and the industries of not I and not J don't cite each other or supply each other, it's reasonable to think that these meetings are primarily capturing serendipitous meetings driven by the kind of meetings geography of the city. Okay, and by that I mean the layout of relevant amenities, transportation, housing that separates I and J, or not I and not J. And you know, these types of this type of meetings geography is really at the root of Jacob's spillovers, these kind of that leads to these kind of chance encounters. So if that's reasonable, then we're going to need one more thing to construct an instrument, which is we're going to need that we can take a not I, not J pair that's adjacent to I and adjacent to J. And if indeed that meeting's geography is correlated between not I, not J and I and J, then we have potentially a relevant instrument for total meetings between I and J, that is the total meetings between these unconnected firms, not I, not J. Okay, and that's going to really be the bedrock of our instrument. We're not going to use any of the variation from actual I and J meetings. We're going to use their neighbors' meetings with each other, and particularly only neighbors who are in very different industries from each other. Okay, so that's the basic idea. I'll talk about the exclusion restriction. Obviously, that's not enough for us to be home and dry. But before I do, let me just kind of mention a little bit about what we mean by serendipitous meetings here. So we're not saying I'm in the line in the coffee shop and I strike up a conversation with someone I've never met before. We expect that most of these serendipitous meetings are leading to knowledge flows. Are you bumping into someone you already know? Maybe someone who you used to go to college with, or someone who you worked at in a former job, or someone you met at a friend's party. And these serendipitous meetings kind of lead you to strike up a conversation with them and maybe discover that there's some knowledge one of you has that is useful to the other. And so in that sense, there's kind of this underlying social network in Silicon Valley, and these serendipitous meetings are activating links on that social network. Okay, so that's kind of how we think about this, and certainly we did a little bit of qualitative work when I was on sabbatical in the Bay Area, and certainly from the workers I spoke to, those were how these knowledge flows occur. The other thing I should say is, these meetings between I and J may be because people are deliberately going to locations hoping to meet people. Okay, the kind of classic example of a place people deliberately go hoping to meet people are bars. And that's kind of also the examples which I gave in the Tom Wolfe quote earlier. And where our identifying variation is going to be coming from is, while people from I and J may both like to go to bars to try and meet people, because of the kind of meetings geography of the city, it may be the case that I and J end up going to the same bar. They go to the Wagon Wheel. Meanwhile, another I and J pair, I is going to Chez Yvonne's and J is going to the Roundhouse, and so they don't end up meeting each other. And so this meetings geography is kind of determining whether or not I is meeting J, not whether or not I'm deliberately, going to these locations with a hope of meeting people. Okay, so how are we going to implement this? So what we're going to do is a fairly obvious thing, which is we're going to draw 1 kilometer donuts around I and J. We'll take all firms in those donuts, and we'll throw out any pairs that are in the same industry. Their industries ever cite each other. That's the big one. That's going to throw out more than half the pairs. Or industries supply or buy from each other. And then we're essentially just going to take averages of the total meetings between those not I, not J pairs, where we're going to upweight the total meeting probabilities for not I, not J pairs that are very close to I and J, and downweight the ones that are kind of on the edge of the donuts. Okay, and this is going to give us our kind of instrument. I'm going to call this chance meetings between I and J with a hat on it to say it's a prediction of the chance meetings between I and J coming from not I, not J. Maybe it would be less confusing to call it total meetings, not I, not J, but this is what we're calling it at present. So this is our instrument coming from the total meetings between firms that we think have very few reasons to meet for planned meetings, and so is kind of the serendipitous meetings between not I and not J, and that's going to be an instrument for IJ meetings. Okay, what does that variation look like? Here's the same figure I showed you before, but now with this chance meetings variation for Google bilaterally compared to every other establishment. It looks kind of similar as before, but let's zoom in. So this is the chance meetings variation. This is the totals meetings variation I showed you before. Okay, the chance, the totals. So as you can see, there's the chance meetings variations more strongly correlated with geography. As you might expect, you're more likely to be bumping into people close by than further away. Meanwhile, the actual meetings, there's more dispersion because obviously the directed search should be less related to geography, and that's picking up both the combination of chance meetings and directed search. Okay, so let me spend 2 slides talking about the exclusion restriction.
David, before yes, you go to the exclusion restriction, let me go back to Julia's questions about the time that the people are in the same location. Do you use the same time length for the chance meeting than for the total meeting?
Yes, yeah, so it's exactly the same measure. So, if I was there together if we were there together for 2 hours, then that would essentially count as 4 meetings because there would be 4 of these half-hour meetings.
But for the chance meeting, you wouldn't want to use only short meetings instead of the...
That's interesting. I mean, it's perfectly possible that we both like to go work in a coffee shop and sit there for 4 hours,
True.
and that might still be a chance meeting. But that's something we could think about doing. Okay, so let me talk about the exclusion restriction. So, here's our estimating equation. And what we're going to need is that our kind of instrument, our chance meetings probability between I and j, is independent of the error term. Okay, and so that first problem, reverse causation, is dealt with because we're not using anything about the behaviors of I and j here. These are the behaviors of not I and not j. And so that kind of deals with that. And I should just note that this argument doesn't rest on us fully eliminating any work-related meetings from not I and not j. And this kind of comes to Marcelo's question. Even if there are some planned meetings still in the not I, not j meetings, those planned meetings, the kind of reason for them would have to be correlated with IJ citation behavior, right? So if we're meeting because we both share a lawyer or something, then there's no reason to think that would lead I and j to cite each other. The fact that not I, not j share a lawyer. I'll come back to that in a second. And here we're aided by the fact that, remember, not I, not j, their industries never cited each other. So that kind of gives us an extra layer of defense. The fact that it would have to lead the error term would have to be correlated between not I and not j, and it would have to lead to citations in I and j, but not citations in not I and not j, since those industries never cite each other. Okay, so what's left? Well, we have emitted variable concerns, and those are kind of generally that firms may cite each other more intensively, I and j, and they may also and firms may co-locate close to each other, and that will lead not I to look quite similar to I and not j to look quite similar to j, and we could be have bias from these spatial correlations of these errors. So how are we going to deal with this? So in 3 ways broadly. The first is, the most obvious problems accounted for by very rich controls for physical distance. Okay, we have controls here for driving time, for driving distance, and for physical distance, and we're going to use cubics of all of those. So if I want to locate close to Intel because I want to visit them a lot, and that's why I'm kind of co-locating, then we're going to be controlling for the fact that we're only comparing firms that are all 1 kilometer from Intel. Okay, so the more sophisticated version of that worry, which is that firms may be choosing locations based on access to workers. So potentially to the west of Intel, there's a bunch of high-skilled workers, and to the east, there's low-skilled workers. Then a firm that locates to the west may also want to access those high-skilled workers, and the one that locates to the east, the low-skilled workers, and firms with high-skilled workers may cite each other more. Okay, so that's going to be potentially problematic. And so what we're going to do there is very directly is we're going to, because we know, where these workers live in each establishment, we can work out the census block group they're in and detailed demographics at that census block group level. It's going to give us measures of income, race, education, including the share with our postgraduate degrees, etc. And then we can bilaterally control for cubics in the difference in all of these different dimensions between workers at establishment I and workers at establishment j. Okay, so that's kind of directly going to deal with the fact that these firms may have similar types of workers, and that's why they cite each other more. And more generally, this is going to mitigate a kind of general version of that worry, which is that more meetings is picking up the fact between not I and not j is picking up the fact that these are kind of similar types, and similar types also like to cite each other. Here we're also helped, as I said on the previous slide, by the fact that these similar types would have to lead to them want to cite each other in I and j, but not in not I, not j, since we know not I and not j never cite each other. So essentially another way of thinking of that is we're throwing out all the pairs where the types are potentially going to be similar, and instead, the not I, not J pairs are, one of them is a cleaning supplies company, and the other one is a medical equipment company or something, and so they're kind of less likely to have these kind of similar types, which leads to these spatially correlated errors. Okay, so the remaining concern here is the most direct one, which is firms are choosing locations specifically based on the probability of meeting other workers. Here we'd argue that it's going to be a relatively small bias just because firms need to know these probabilities, and these type of data have only very recently become available. Maybe they could do so crudely, but then they'd still need to find vacant offices. They'd have to have made their choice relatively recently if the amenities are changing over time. So ideally, we would solve this problem by using a panel and looking at what happens when new apartment buildings or new amenities open up, but we simply don't have a long enough panel to do that. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make one further restriction, and we're not going to use all not I, not J meetings. Instead, we're only going to use the meetings that occur more than 5 kilometers from either establishment. And the idea here is that, while a firm may care a lot about the coffee shops right by it and whether they're the right side of Intel, whether or not their workers are going to bump into Intel workers in the shopping mall 8 miles away is not going to be salient or pivotal in the firm's location decision. This restriction is also going to mitigate worries that amenities are endogenous to IJ meetings. So, for example, if there are 2 firms close by, say Google and Apple, and their workers need to meet each other a lot, a coffee shop may open up in between them, which will also lead to not I, not J meeting each other more. If we're restricting to more than 5 kilometers away, we'd argue that the kind of location of those amenities is not being driven substantially by this particular IJ pair that's more than 5 kilometers away from I and from J. Okay, so that's kind of deal with that concern that may be a big concern if we're looking at 2 firms that are a kilometer away from each other. Okay, so let me briefly talk about interpreting the IV coefficients, and I'll pause for a minute if there are any questions. So as I mentioned in the intro, with any instrumental variable, if there's treatment heterogeneity, at best we're getting a local average treatment effect. These are the citations induced by the kind of meetings geography underlying this chance meetings probability. And in particular, we're potentially picking up both meetings geography shifting serendipitous meetings between I and J and planned face-to-face meetings between I and J, because it lowers the meeting costs. If there's a blue bottle coffee that's between us, we may be more likely to meet face-to-face than at all or on the phone. Okay, and these 2 types of meetings may have very different returns, and so it would obviously be interesting to decompose those. So what can we learn just from the late? Well, if we find a positive coefficient on total meetings, we can reject the null that face-to-face meetings do not affect knowledge flows. And the magnitude is also very informative if I care about kind of economic geography or urban planning, to understanding the returns to making people bump into each other more. And that's exactly what we're getting from this late. Later, I'm going to provide a test for whether this late is measuring the size of these Jacob spillovers, and we can provide some evidence for the existence of these spillovers that were so important to Jane Jacobs. Okay, so before I continue, are there any pressing questions? I guess I only have 11 minutes, but if anything's come up.
No questions, David. You can go ahead. And then if there are questions, we can leave them for the last 15 minutes, and participants will be able to raise their hand and ask the questions directly to you.
Okay. Okay, so here's the first stage. We have a strong first stage. I regress total meetings on chance meetings probability. We have a huge F-stat. That's not surprising if you go and look at the maps I showed you. Most of the meetings we think between a particular IJ pair seem to be these kind of serendipitous ones, and our instrument is picking those up quite well. Okay, let me talk through our main results. So first column is the OLS. Here we do find a strong positive relationship between pattern citations between I and J and total meetings probability. I'll give you an interpretation of the magnitude in a second. Our first column, the IV, is where we instrument total meetings probability with those total meetings between not I and not J that I'm calling the predicted chance meetings between I and J. The coefficient actually goes up, and that's consistent with there being a lot of attenuation in the OLS, as you'd expect when we have really quite a noisy measure of actual meetings between I and J based on this smartphone proximity. We're doing reasonably large boxes, and maybe they didn't actually bump into each other or see each other, and so we're not surprised that there's a substantial measurement error. The next column, we include cubics in those 3 distance measures I mentioned. The coefficient actually becomes stronger rather than attenuates. The reason for this is actually, once we condition on total meetings, distance actually has the opposite sign to what we'd expect. So distance really matters for citations between I and J, but not once we condition on total meetings. And so that's some evidence that the kind of literature thus far that's been using distance, it's really meetings that matters. It's not this physical distance. That was purely kind of a proxy for those meetings. The fourth column further includes demographic cubics in these 11 demographic controls we have, things like income or share with college degrees based on the share with postgraduate degrees based on their census block group demographics. It's kind of reassuring that although the coefficients fall, they only fall a little bit. And so an argument like Altonji's, where there's a whole bunch of omitted variables, the ones we can observe, if they don't lead to a lot of attenuation, then plausibly the ones we can't observe are not doing a whole lot in generating bias. But that's obviously a loose statement. And then finally, once we instrument by throwing out all of the not I, not J meetings that are less than 5 kilometers from I and J, the number goes up a little bit, and this is going to be our baseline. This is using all of the controls plus using this 5 kilometer instrument. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about magnitudes. I guess so the first thing I would say is, if I just ran this pattern citations on total meetings, and instead of total meetings, I included distance, I would get an elasticity that's half as large as the elasticity in column 2. I guess that's the first thing this is telling us, which is, this final elasticity is twice as large as the pure distance elasticity. So this is telling us that these meetings matter. They matter more, at least in the elasticity sense, than distance does. Let me try and talk about magnitudes in a clearer way. So if we brought the total meetings probability down 1%, then running that through this inverse hyperbolic sine, that's going to reduce citations by about 0.28%. Okay, so this is a substantial effect, but not enormous. To give you some sort of comparison, Jaffe et al. Find a 3.2 to 7.5% increase in the likelihood of me citing a firm that's in the same MSA as myself. We're getting kind of similar magnitudes, although they're not quite comparable, if we kind of bring total meetings probabilities down by 25%. This is also informative of what the impacts might be of moving many firms to working from home more post-COVID. We're in the process of doing a better job on trying to work out how much meetings would drop absent any lockdowns when, say, half of Facebook employees are working from home 4 days a week. We're in the process of doing that counterfactual, but this suggests that there will be implications for knowledge flows. Okay, we have a bunch of robustness in the paper. We haven't yet had time to update all the robustness to a new specification we're using, but this is just from the reduced form regressions. But the only thing I'll kind of note here is that most of the actions on the extensive margin. In particular, what matters is whether I cite someone at all, not how much I cite them. Okay, and there's a bunch of other robustness on almost all of those different choices we made at various points in the paper. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, there are potentially size effects. It may matter how many colleagues I have, not just the probability of me bumping into you, but if I have lots of colleagues, then there's a higher probability someone in my establishment will bump into someone in your establishment. And indeed, we find strong support for that. There are size effects when I interact it with the product of workers at I and product at workers of J. It could also be that, you know, knowledge flows more readily lead through to patenting in larger firms who have in-house lawyers who can go and defend the patents later. We can't separate those two hypotheses. Okay, so let me spend the last couple of minutes talking about serendipitous meetings and whether we can identify those effects, those late effects, as the returns to serendipity. So if you recall, our IV picks up potentially two things, both these Jacob spillovers induced by chance meetings, by serendipitous meetings, or the returns to kind of planned face-to-face meetings that are also maybe induced by our instrument. So in particular, we can write down the following structural relationship. Citations between I and J depend both on the chance meetings between I and J. This is not our instrument, this is the true chance meetings, and the planned meetings between I and J. And they may depend differently on those two. There's a kind of a gamma 1 on these chance meetings and a gamma 2 on these planned meetings. And the returns to serendipity, i.e. these Jacob spillovers, is gamma 1, and the returns to these organized face-to-face meetings is gamma 2. Okay, there may also be heterogeneity in gamma 2 and heterogeneity in gamma 1, but let's just take the simple case for now. So to separately identify each spillover, the obvious way to do this is to get measures of the chance meetings between I and J and measures between the chance meetings between the planned meetings between I and J. And then if we have two instruments, we can just go and estimate gamma 1 and gamma 2. But as I mentioned earlier, it's simply not possible for us to partition the meetings between I and J into chance meetings and planned meetings. We don't know whether the fact that these people from these two firms were close to each other was organized or not. However, what I'll show you is if we have suitable instruments for chance and planned, we will be able to test whether the late estimate I showed you before was equal to gamma 1. Okay, so let me talk through that. So we're going to need two assumptions. The first is we have two instruments, Z1 and Z2, that differentially affect chance and planned meetings. Okay, so they can't be the same instrument. One has to load differently on chance vis-a-vis planned than the other. Okay, the second assumption is that at least one of our IVs affects chance meetings. So we have a relevant instrument for chance meetings. Now, if you believe our instrumentation strategy before, our instrument is definitely relevant. And so the further assumption here is that it's definitely affecting chance meetings. Okay, so that chance meetings IJ is affected by our proxy for chance meetings coming from not I, not J firms who have no reason to meet for work reasons. Okay, so if that's the case, then we can regress pattern citations on total meetings probability. If we instrument with Z1, then we're going to get a weighted average of gamma 1 and gamma 2. If we instrument with Z2, we'll get a different weighted average that places different weights on gamma 1 and gamma 2, where the weights depend on the relative loading on chance meetings and planned meetings of those two instruments. Okay, so this leads to our proposition, which is if A1 and A2 are true, then we can do an over-identification test for whether the coefficient we get from using instrument 1, beta 1, equals the coefficient we get from instrument 2. And if they are the same, then our IV estimates are recovering gamma 1. There's two cases there. Either gamma 1 equals gamma 2, in which case it doesn't matter which instrument we use, we're getting the same thing because it's a weighted average of two things that are identical. Or we don't have a first stage for planned meetings. Our instrument isn't actually shifting the cost of planned meetings in a meaningful way, in which case all we were getting in the first place was gamma 1. Now, we can't discriminate between those two, but it doesn't matter if we want to test the hypothesis that what I told you before was gamma 1. Okay, so that's essentially what we're going to do. Where are we going to get these instruments that satisfy this? So our instruments that may satisfy these conditions are workday chance meetings coming from not I, not J meetings, and night and weekend chance meetings from not I, not J. And so essentially the idea here is that if there are some of these chance meetings that are shifting the cost of having a planned meeting, it's likely to be ones close to the office, ones occurring during working hours, and less likely to be ones occurring night and weekend, although not impossible. So if that's true, that's going to satisfy A1. We're going to have differential loading between these two instruments on planned and chance. And given the way we've constructed these, it's very reasonable to think that if there is a first stage, the first stage is coming on chance meetings, at least, given that all of these are kind of instruments which we've created to proxy chance meetings. Okay, so we can go and kind of break out that variation. There's a workday variation, there's a night weekend variation. And very quickly, here's what happens if we run with the night IV. Here's what happens if we run with the day IV. We can't reject that those coefficients are the same. A J-test doesn't reject. And so we can conclude that what I was showing you before is gamma 1 is the returns to serendipity. Can I go further than that? Well, if instead of using these meetings more than 5 kilometers away from I and J, we use all meetings coming from not I and not J, so I don't exclude the ones that are close by the two office buildings, then actually the relative magnitudes of night and day flip, and we can reject that these are the same. And so those are the ones which we think are, the ones close to the office buildings are more likely to be cost shifters to planned meetings. And so this is at least suggestive that the returns to planned meetings are higher than the returns to chance. But once we've restricted meetings to more than 5 kilometers, we no longer have a valid instrument, a relevant instrument for our planned meetings. Okay, then we also have regressions on labor market flows, which I won't have time to go through, but we do find workers move between firms when they bump into each other more. And so let me just conclude, and I'll have time for discussion afterwards. So we find that face-to-face interactions as measured through geolocation data increase knowledge flows. And we have evidence that that at least this effect is, there is a strong effect of serendipitous interactions. And the estimates we get can be interpreted as returns to serendipity. And this echoes much of Jane Jacobs' work on the importance of chance encounters facilitated by urban density. So obviously there's more work to do. In particular, that post-COVID work from home counterfactual is in the works, as well as thinking more about the mechanics of these serendipitous meetings, what types of chance meetings matter, why are we finding these scale effects, etc. So thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, David. We start having a few questions, so Miguel, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly to David.
Hi, David. So this is a very simple question. So if you know the locations of people, you can also know what are the most common locations that people go to. And perhaps you can have a measure of random meetings when two people go to uncommon places or those places that don't have any time series patterns. So I can differentiate the places that each person go, and then when they go to uncommon places, two people, it's very likely that there is a random meeting. So perhaps I don't know. I want to know what you think about this.
That's an interesting idea. I guess it's not a priori. It's not clear to me if I start going to unlikely places. Is that because we both go to unlikely places? It's not because that must have been planned or because it must have been chance. So it's not 100% clear there. One thing we could do, and we've thought about, is we could essentially, try and work out kind of a gravity model of where people go from each location, and then try to use kind of variation in those kind of general gravity, generated by those general gravity coefficients, as a kind of different way of trying to capture what are these chance meetings. And we have been thinking about potentially implementing that, which is obviously related.
Thank you very much, David. Teresa, you have a question?
Hi, David. It was a super interesting presentation. So here's a question. You mentioned that you can control for the demographic differences among workers and those kind of things using, I think it was just the census block information. But I wondered if you could look, I don't know if there's any way for you to look and see if interactions that would normally happen among groups that are different in some ways, I don't know if it's different race or different age or just some kinds of demographics, if those disproportionately happen more, do they actually also lead to more sites, because maybe we sort of self-segregate ourselves in ways, and then when that gets undone, maybe there's benefits there. And that would kind of speak to some of the costs, right, of current issues that we're trying to battle.
That's very interesting. Yeah, so you're basically saying, can we find some unusual crosses of groups, and are those particularly fruitful interactions? That's something we could certainly think about. It's kind of Matt Jenskow and Susan Athey have a paper on how often different types meet each other, thinking about polarization. It's kind of a cross of those two. That would be interesting. We should think about how straightforward that be to implement, but that certainly might make Jane Jacobs happy if that was strongly true.
Fadi, I think you have a question.
Yes, hi David, great paper. Just similar to Teresa actually, in terms of getting closer to the causes, like looking, I don't know if you looked at these effects at some samples where I and J are competitors, or when they actually along the same supply chain, just to get a sense of what can be derived in terms of the role of competition versus supply chain type of spillovers.
That's a good question. So we've already kind of coded up whether or not I'm a supplier or a buyer for not I or not J in order to exclude those pairs. And so we could just go and use the flip of that to see whether there's heterogeneity when I and J, our suppliers, are in industries that supply each other. That's something interesting to do. We should think about that.
Thank you, Fadi. Thank you, David. Julia, I think you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, David, for the presentation. A little bit related to things that were mentioned already, but one thing I was thinking was that there might be some informativeness that is now being pulled together in the measure you're using for meetings, in the sense that two workers from an establishment meeting with 5 workers are 10 meetings in one slot, which gives you the same if you have 10 one-on-one meetings spread out throughout the day, so just bilateral. So I wonder if that gives you some information that can also give either an additional instrument for the chance meetings as opposite to the planned ones. So, and a related thought I had connected to what Teresa said about kind of similar people. My thought was more related to the instrument and the validity of the instrument. And what I wonder is if citations might be between I and J might be driven by the fact that people are friends or people are neighbors and they want to please their friends. And if I prime and J prime belong to the same neighborhoods or friendship groups, then there might be something there in the exclusion restriction. You might have addressed this already, but the thought came along the lines of Teresa's argument.
Okay, so those 2 questions, excellent questions. So in terms of kind of, does it make a difference if there's 10 one-on-ones versus a group meeting? I think that's an interesting question. It may make a big difference in terms of the exclusion restriction, in terms of are these chance meetings. It's hard for me to, it's hard for us to say one is chance and one isn't. You may have a big team meeting with the other team, or you may have one-on-ones. What we have thought about doing is, potentially seeing whether or not we get different effects when, meetings are, say, the same person constantly meeting the other person, or whether it's 10 different people in the firm meeting each other. And that's something we can certainly look at. Or this idea of is smaller groups or bigger groups matter. All of these are kind of interesting, kind of, on this last bullet on my conclusion, trying to think about the mechanics of serendipitous meetings. And these are important and fascinating questions. In terms of the friends or neighbors, so, that's kind of one form of this kind of correlated, spatially correlated error term potentially. And while I'm not going to claim we've, fully brought the bias down to 0, my hope is that the bias is minimal, conditional on us controlling for bilateral types using the demographics controls, conditional on us focusing only on not I, not J pairs, where they're much less likely to be friends, because friends that types of friends that lead to citations, because those not I, not J have never ever cited each other. But you know, is it, you know, totally watertight? No. I guess the other thing I would say there is that you know, friends or neighbors are kind of what we're calling serendipity in some sense. Like if I bumped into someone in a bar and started dating, we'd see a lot of meetings between those not I and not J's. And that would also be predictive that someone from I and J may be dating, because they'd also bumped into each other at the same bar. And so, you know, when I call them serendipitous meetings, some of these are friendships, and you know, maybe I'm now much better friends with this guy who I knew a little bit before, because we work kind of close to each other, and it's kind of convenient for us to meet after work. So, so that's kind of inside our serendipity. We are still obviously worried about that potentially leading to some bias, and I hope we're mitigating things as best as we can there. There's a question from Giacomo, is that?
Yes, Giacomo?
Hey, David, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining.
Just more curiosity, actually, just from anecdotal observation. So people coordinate if they get to the same place at the same time, roughly. Have you ever thought about using that type of variation? So, you know, people actually literally bump into each other at the coffee shop. Because, you know, there's two ways to think about this. One is that they coordinate exactly, so they get in by exactly the same time if they're very, very sharp. Or, you know, the bumping is that, you know, I'm sitting there and then, you know, Enrico comes by and sits down and we start chatting about things. Have you ever tried to use that type of variation? Because, I mean, you know exactly when people arrive.
Yeah,
you know exactly
that's very interesting. We haven't thought about that type of variation. That could be valuable. The slight issue is, say we're trying to use this to partition the meetings between I and J. So if we're trying to do that, then the problem is, even if we get a subset of them that right, we really need to partition the full set, because the measurement error is perfectly inversely correlated, right? When I'm splitting a large set into planned and chance, if we say wanted to run those regressions to uncover gamma 1 and gamma 2 that I showed you at the end.
But you can use a weighted version of that, right? So you don't need to do the full partitioning. You can actually, you know, do a weighted version of what you're saying by, you know, waiting for the distance between when someone arrives and how long they sit together. The same place.
Well, I don't think we can use that to uncover gamma 1 and gamma 2. Just because any error we make is kind of exactly the opposite on the other one. And so we won't be able to uncover gamma 1 and gamma 2 using an IV. But what that would help, which is what that would help for potentially, is we could potentially throw out the not I, not J meetings where they arrived at the same time, to kind of further remove the planned ones, which we kind of have a prior, are going to be maybe potentially more worrisome in terms of spatially correlated IJs. But I should just repeat that you know, just because they're planned meetings in our instrument doesn't mean they're going to bias our estimate. Whatever led them to have a planned meeting has to be in not I, not J, has to be correlated with the error term in IJ, right? So it has to be something about these spatially correlated types or something. That may firm up that. At least that's the way I would think about it. I'd be happy to talk more if you thought there was a way for us to use you know, some subset to estimate gamma 1 and gamma 2. That would be wonderful.
I will let you, David and Giacomo, talk about it later, because we have a last question by Anna Gumpert.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. If I may, I'd actually like to ask a question on how you think about the post-COVID counterfactual. So, I mean, maybe you're not there yet, but maybe you are, and then this could be super informative. My question is, so if I think about kind of working from home and the relationship between working from home and innovation from a kind of within firm perspective, I have a quite clear prior. So I see my colleagues less frequently, so there's less knowledge spillovers within firms, and so I should expect innovation to go down. Now, in your setting, I've been wondering, is the prior that clear? So on the one hand, I meet fewer people, but because I'm not going to the office, so I'm not going to those coffee shops. But then again, even if I work from home, unless there's kind of a complete lockdown, I'm gonna go to the coffee shop close to where I live, and then I may meet different people. So in that sense, I was wondering, should I think about this more in terms of we expect a negative effect on innovation overall, or should we expect that the direction of innovation changes? And if so, do you have any idea how you could tease out that from for example, the patent data, which kind of types of things people work on? That would be great. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. As you say, it's not entirely clear which way this is going to go. What we're working on doing right now, and it's imperfect, is during the non-COVID time, trying to see people who seem to have shifted from working in the office to working from home and seeing how their number of meetings and geography of meetings change. Now, we don't have like perfect instruments, maybe they were sick. That's why they're working at home for this month or something like that. But that will at least start us trying to answer this question. I guess our prior was that you're meeting more people when you're going, to these dense office areas and coming back from those dense office areas than when you're staying at home the whole time, where you also meet those people close to you on the weekends and such like. But as you said, that may not be true, and we at least hope that the data will tell us some of that. In terms of whether or not they are having less meetings with workers at other patenting firms when they're spending their days at home rather than when they're going into the office.
Thank you very much, David. Unfortunately, has come to the time of ending the workshop. Thank you very much for a very exciting talk. Thank you very much to Anton, who has been answering the questions in the Q&A. And thank you to all participants for being here, for your questions, for your suggestions that I'm sure are going to be very helpful to David, Anton, and Keith moving forward. Our next workshop is on Monday, November 30th, and we will be having Mary Amiti with us. So I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.